Now, analysts say that this is a show that investors see the budget as more of the same this year. Business Unity South Africa telling us earlier in the day that they wanted to see a clearer picture of investor-friendly environment in this context, and it didn't get that. All the main metrics going south for the country in this speech, with the finance minister warning several times in the presser this afternoon that we will go into a sovereign debt crisis if we don't have a mindset change. We've got growth that went down, the budget deficit expanding somewhat, and of course that all-important debt to GDP ratio also having a bit of a turn south. 95% to GDP by the 2025 year, and that's not a good sign at all. I want to bring in Sanisha Packirisamy. She's from Momentum, an economist there. Sanisha, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. So here you have the finance minister wanting to go ahead with these expenditure cuts. It looks like public sector workers will bear the brunt of this. If I understand correctly, what is that, 307 billion rand in the next 3 years. Can you make sense of whether or not we are really seeing finally a move to cut wages? Because remember, we still have court cases to go through.
Thanks, Devan. Thanks for having me on your show. Yes, as you say, the bulk of the expenditure cuts that government has put in place in this medium-term budget is essentially going to come from the civil servant wage bill. And what they have suggested is that on average, in nominal terms, we are going to see the wage bill growing at 0.8% per annum for the next couple of fiscal years. So in real terms, that actually equates to a negative 2% real increase for the next 3 years. So there is a decisive emphasis from government to start clamping down on these exorbitant wage increases for the next few years in order for us to achieve the fiscal consolidation deadlines that they have put in place.
The other big pillar of this budget today was that lifeline again to SAA. We've got 10.5 billion rand. We also understand that there's a figure of 6.5 billion to settle debt. Who is the casualty of some of these bailouts here? Because the money's coming from somewhere, isn't it?
Indeed. So they have said that the 10.5 billion allocation was based on a reprioritization of other funds. And from what we can see in the budget, some of that has come through from the contingency reserve. So remember that the contingency reserve is like a rainy day fund that government has in place for these unforeseen expenditure items. And that was about 5 billion. They've also lowered the skills development levy, and they've also projected some underspending across some of the departments. So those three together actually give you the 10.5 billion allocation to SA Airways. What I did take some comfort in is that Treasury is assuming no further recapitalization of other state-owned enterprises in the medium term. And if such funding requirements crop up in the medium term, they have suggested that it has to be done on a fiscally neutral basis. In other words, no additional funds will be given to state-owned enterprises. The money will have to be reallocated from elsewhere if these so-called bailouts are expected to materialize further down the line.
Because you are seeing labor-intensive sectors here getting the pinch. I mean, what is it? Learning and culture, 114 billion over the next 4 years. Police and security, 78 billion. So there are casualties indeed. I want to ask you about what the finance minister speaks when he says we've got to understand that you cannot spend your way out of trouble. He spent a lot of time in the budget speech talking about this, where he said in 2009 we spent 1 rand and we got 1 rand 60 cents back. Not the case now. We spend a rand and we're getting much less back. So what do you make of this narrative that he's throwing in, that spending your way out of trouble is not the way to go here?
So, Devin, basically what he's talking about is something called the fiscal multiplier. Now, the fiscal multiplier says that if you spend 1 rand from the fiscus, how much is it actually adding to GDP? And as you say, in the past, it would have added a substantial amount. That has now even gone slightly negative because we have been borrowing at the extent that we have, and our finances are in disarray. So unfortunately, it means that we're not getting the same bang for our buck on the fiscal side as we were before. And the only way to rectify this is to implement the much needed structural reforms to accelerate growth. So in other words, we really need to kickstart growth by accelerating infrastructure projects, by releasing the broadband spectrum, by allowing for electricity generation. These are the elements that are needed in order to support higher growth levels. Only then will we be able to see the fiscal multiplier actually having a bigger impact on growth going forward.
Unfortunately, as Business points out this afternoon, we have got no definitive timelines, deadlines or dates on some of those structural reforms. But Sanisha Packirisamy from Momentum, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. All right.